Hercule Poirot and the Game of Faces. Chapter 1. A Most Unexpected Summons. Hercule Poirot was seated at his modest writing desk in a small but well-appointed London flat when an unfamiliar envelope arrived in the Morning Post. Its cream-colored paper bore a fine embossing, and the precise loops of the handwriting piqued Poirot's curiosity even before he slit it open with his tidy letter opener. He adjusted his reading spectacles, a most delicate motion, and withdrew the single sheet within. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, it would be an honor and a relief if you would grace Farnsworth Manor with your presence. I have planned a gathering of select acquaintances this coming week, a most elegant affair, or so I hope. Yet I confess I have found myself uneasy of late. There are strange undercurrents in the household. I dare not voice them in writing. I ask for your discretion and your brilliance in discerning if my concerns are unfounded or if something truly unsettling lurks behind our facade of civility. Yours in anticipation, Lady Althea Farnsworth." Poirot read and reread these lines, tapping a finger thoughtfully on the polished surface of the desk. Lady Farnsworth's words carried an undercurrent of anxiety, something unspoken but pressing. He set the letter aside, rose to his feet, and quietly began to prepare for the journey. While the invitation seemed innocent enough, an invitation to a country fete, his instincts told him there was more beneath the surface. Poirot took pride in his little grey cells, and they stirred now with expectancy. Hercule Poirot arrived at Farnsworth Manor just as the last rays of the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the frosty courtyard. Although he had traveled by train and then by a borrowed carriage, he appeared as pristine as if he had stepped out of his own study. He wore a crisp dark suit, an elegant cravat of deep burgundy, and a fine overcoat that barely showed signs of the journey. It was the close of the 19th century, and in such remote corners of the English countryside, modern conveniences were scarce, so the gentle clip-clop of horses' hooves provided a suitably old-world accompaniment to the detective's advent. The manor itself rose in the twilight like some slumbering creature, its honey-colored stone walls and ivy-covered arches hinting at a storied past. Light glowed in nearly every window, promising warmth and company within. A uniformed footman stepped out to greet Poirot, bowing low before guiding him up the wide marble steps to the grand entrance hall. The faint scent of wood polish mingled with the aroma of roasting pheasant. Gleaming chandeliers cast dancing reflections on the polished floors, and the hush of a well-run household lent a sense of hush and dignity to the space. At the threshold of the drawing room, Lady Althea Farnsworth awaited him, her gown of midnight blue velvet trimmed with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She was an imposing figure, tall and slender, her sharp features softened by a fleeting yet genuine smile as she extended her hand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice cultured, "it is a pleasure to have you here at my humble gathering. I have heard such praise of your abilities. I hardly know what to expect." Poirot offered a short bow and gently took her hand. "Madame, the pleasure is mine. One hears many things, but it is always better to judge by what one sees. Your home is most gracious." His accent, a soft ripple of Belgian French, lent his words an unusual charm. She guided him into a drawing room festooned with wreaths of holly and evergreen sprigs, reminders of the festive season just past. A gentle hum of conversation filled the air. Guests, scattered in small clusters of animated discussion, turned polite smiles in Poirot's direction. The detective surveyed them with thoughtful interest, noting the variety of faces. A portly gentleman leaning on a cane, a young woman in pale lavender, an anxious expression, an older lady wrapped in ostrich feathers, and several others whose laughter rose in bright trills above the general murmur. "Come, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Althea said, escorting him toward a table laden with refreshment. "I insist you sample our local cider, and afterwards I shall be honored if you join me and the other guests in the ballroom. Tonight, we have planned something, well, a little whimsical." Poirot's dark, alert eyes darted toward her. "Whimsical, madame? You have piqued my curiosity." She gave a small, conspiratorial smile. "Yes, tonight, at the stroke of midnight, my guests will all don masks and swap them amongst ourselves. It's a game, the game of faces, if you will. Each person will, for a few moments, adopt a new visage, and..." She paused, leaning in with a mischievous twinkle. "There may or may not be a prize for the best impersonation. It's all in good fun, of course." "Of course," Poirot echoed with a quiet nod. "And yet one's true nature can hide behind such a fine disguise, n'est-ce pas?" She laughed lightly, tapping him with her fan. "You are quite perceptive, Monsieur Poirot. But in such a small community as ours, I doubt there is much to unearth." He inclined his head, his small, neat moustache curving slightly. "I have found, Lady Farnsworth, that in both small communities and large, there are secrets aplenty, if one knows where to look." They joined the other guests who were drifting toward the ballroom. The wide, arched doorway revealed an impressive space of parquet floors and tall windows now covered in rich velvet drapes. An orchestra, seated off to one side, played a lilting waltz that soared through the high ceilings. The swirl of gowns and the sparkle of jewels under the chandeliers lent a festive air to the occasion. Servants moved gracefully among the assemblage, offering glasses of champagne and plates of dainty pastries. Poirot moved about, conversing politely, always listening intently to the chatter. He introduced himself modestly, smiling at polite inquiries into his little grey cells, as he liked to call his mental powers. Now and again, a snatch of conversation reached his ears that made him arch an eyebrow. Hush-toned references to debts or whispered suggestions of old family quarrels that were quickly smothered under polite smiles. But each time, Poirot merely offered a gentle remark and continued on, filing away these murmurs for later reflection. A few minutes before midnight, Lady Althea gave the signal for the masks to be distributed. A servant appeared with a large lacquered box, and the guests crowded eagerly around. Each drew out a mask at random, some fierce, some comical, others brightly plumed or eerily blank. Laughter flitted about the room as the guests held the masks up for inspection, commenting on the odd shapes and colors. "Remember, mes amis," Poirot said softly to a small circle of amused onlookers, "with the striking of midnight, you must become, if only for a moment, something new. Perhaps you shall even discover a hidden facet of yourself." A young woman with laughing eyes, Lady Farnsworth's niece, perhaps, smiled at him. "And which mask will you choose, Monsieur Poirot?" He politely declined to pick from the box. "I fear I have come unprepared for such masquerades. My own face must suffice." She giggled, though she seemed faintly disappointed. "Ah, but you would make such a wonderful masked presence. Let me see if I can find one for you." Poirot shook his head with a kindly firmness. "Ah, no, my dear mademoiselle. I prefer to see and not be seen." The great clock in the hallway, an elaborate timepiece with gilded cherubs, let out the first sonorous note of midnight. Conversation fell away as each guest seized their mask and held it aloft. 12 resonant chimes rang through the house, echoing across polished floors and trailing along candlelit corridors. With each toll, more faces disappeared behind colorful disguises, transforming the glittering assembly into a carnival of strangers. Some masks were gaudy, bedecked with shimmering feathers. Others were crafted to look grotesque, with twisted mouths and exaggerated eyes. Poirot stepped back, content to observe. He could not help but feel an undercurrent of tension beneath the merriment. It was little more than a hunch, a detective's intuition that perhaps the swirl of masks and swirling dance steps hid more than just bright laughter. But he kept his observations to himself for now. On the final, 12th stroke, the music struck a triumphant chord, and the great double doors into the corridor were thrown open. Many guests flitted out, half laughing, half shrieking in mock alarm, desperate to avoid giving away their identities. "Is that you, Elizabeth?" one gentleman called, only to be answered with a playful cackle from a masked figure who scurried away. The effect was both playful and faintly eerie, like some dream where one cannot quite name the faces around them. Poirot watched Lady Farnsworth, who chose a simple half-mask of black velvet that framed her aristocratic features. She caught his eye from across the room, gave a tiny nod of acknowledgement, then disappeared into the crush of masked revelers. The detective lingered, deliberately hanging back to see if any face, or any mask, looked back with hidden intent. For several moments, the house was a carnival of illusions. Torch-lit hallways and candelabra-lit rooms filled with the shapes and sounds of concealed guests. The atmosphere vibrated with excitement, laughter blending with the rustle of silk and the tap of shoes on polished floors. Someone called for the dance to continue, and more voices joined in. Through an open doorway, Poirot glimpsed couples twirling with dramatic flair, masked faces craning to catch glimpses of companions they could not fully recognize. Then, amid the revelry, came a single, piercing cry. It swept along the corridor like a sudden wind, tangling with the music and shattering the cheerful air. In an instant, all pretense of merriment vanished. Masks turned in alarm and conversation ceased, as if severed by a knife. The violinist playing in the corner gave a squeak of dissonance and abruptly stopped. Poirot straightened, tension rippling through him. A new hush settled over the house, a hush born not of propriety but of fear. It was that brand of silence which arises only when danger has truly broken in upon festivities. He stepped into the hallway, every sense alert. Masks hovered on every face, making it impossible at first glance to know who was who. The expressionless visages held a certain grimness now, their once whimsical features seeming almost menacing in the flickering candlelight. A clamor of footsteps echoed down the corridor, drawing Poirot onward. He walked quickly, stepping past startled guests, searching for the origin of that cry. Somewhere in the dark hush of Farnsworth Manor, tragedy had found its way in. And as the last echoes of that panicked cry faded, Hercule Poirot felt a certitude blossom within him. The game of faces had only just begun. Chapter 2. At the stroke of midnight, a cry in the dark. At once, the entire household froze. The sudden, piercing cry that had shattered the jovial atmosphere at Farnsworth Manor lingered on the air, echoing through candlelit corridors and gilded doorways like an unresolved chord. Hercule Poirot, still standing near the threshold of the ballroom, felt the soft brush of passing figures in fantastical masks who ran toward the source of that dreadful sound. Yet, despite the tumult, his mind began to work with a clarity that rarely deserted him. "Mon Dieu," he murmured under his breath. "Already, it begins." Gone was the frivolity of the masquerade, the gleaming feathers, the midnight laughter, the playful guessing of identities. In a heartbeat, all had been replaced by a charged silence, broken only by hurried footsteps, frantic whispers, and the uncertain flicker of the wall sconces that cast long dancing shadows. Poirot smoothed his moustache, took a breath, and glided through the swirling confusion. "Monsieur Poirot!" A voice came from behind him, a masked gentleman, short of breath and trembling. By the slight build and anxious tone, Poirot surmised it was Frederick Farnsworth, Lord Farnsworth's nephew. The young man lowered his mask, revealing a face pale with alarm. It came from the corridor leading to the side antechambers, I am certain of it. Poirot offered a grave nod. Then, mon cher monsieur, let us investigate together. We must waste no time. The corridor was lit by only a few sputtering candles. Still, enough light remained to illuminate the sight that awaited them. A small knot of guests, some masked, others having hastily removed their disguises, stood in a semicircle near an ornate door. One or two ladies were visibly distraught, clutching handkerchiefs to trembling lips, while the gentleman tried to maintain composure. A hush fell the moment Poirot arrived, his presence somehow imbuing the gathering with a faint semblance of order. At the center of it all, slumped against the wainscoting, lay a footman. His livery, neatly pressed earlier in the evening, was now rumpled and stained where he had collapsed. In the flickering candlelight, his face appeared unnaturally still. It was clear, tragically clear, that this young man was beyond all help. A strangled sob came from Lady Althea Farnsworth herself, who stood apart from the rest, her mask of black velvet slipped to the side, revealing eyes wide with horror. Is he? Poirot knelt down, placing a gentle hand on the man's wrist, though he already suspected what he would find. He then pressed his fingertips lightly at the side of the footman's neck. Alas, madame, Poirot said quietly. He's gone. A collective gasp escaped the assembled company. Lady Althea's composure wavered, and she turned away, dabbing her eyes with the lace cuff of her gown. Poirot rose, giving the group a somber yet commanding glance. Everyone, please return to the drawing room, he said, his voice both soothing and insistent. We must have order, in the midst of chaos, yes? Let me see exactly what has happened here. No one moved at first. Fear and confusion appeared to paralyze them. Then, a firm tone cut through the tension. You heard, Monsieur Poirot, said a crisp voice, Lord Farnsworth himself, tall and silver-haired, removing a lurid mask of a mythical creature. His gaze flicked to the footman's body, and a look of deep concern flashed in his eyes. Come away now. We must let Poirot do his work. Slowly, the crowd receded down the corridor. Murmurs rose and fell, carrying theories and wild guesses of foul play. Poirot remained behind, kneeling once more beside the unfortunate victim. He carefully lifted the edge of the footman's jacket, observing that there were no obvious wounds. The man's eyes were shut, as though he had simply fallen asleep. Yet a single detail, the faint, curious odor that lingered in the air, pricked Poirot's keen senses. He rose and spotted a faint swirl of movement at the far end of the corridor. Emerging from the gloom came a tall, stooped figure wearing the manor's livery. Another servant, apparently. This man halted as soon as he spied Poirot, wide-eyed and trembling. Sir, I came to see what had happened. I heard the scream, he said in a wavering tone. John, that's the footman. He was supposed to be helping in the kitchen after the masks were distributed. Poirot regarded the servant with sympathy, tempered by curiosity. Your name, if you please? Thomas, sir, third footman. The man's face was pale, and he tugged anxiously at his collar. Is John... Poirot nodded gravely. Oui, mon ami. He has been taken from this world. He lowered his voice, stepping closer to ensure no one else would overhear. Thomas, can you tell me if you noticed anything unusual tonight? Quarrels, suspicious behavior, anything that might help me understand what befell poor John? Thomas's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. I can't say as I saw anything, sir. The house was all in a flurry because of the masks. Guests coming and going in the corridors, some of them giggling, some of them just drifting about. I was busy serving refreshments in the dining hall. I only came down this corridor to fetch some extra candles. Then I heard a terrible scream. Poirot offered a small nod. Very well, Thomas, I thank you. Will you please inform Lord Farnsworth that I will soon ask a few questions of each member of the household? We must not let confusion and fear run rampant. Thomas bowed jerkily. Yes, sir. I'll do as you say. And with that, the footman hurried away, glancing back over his shoulder once, as though uncertain if the sight of John's still form was real, or merely a dreadful apparition. Poirot took a steadying breath and surveyed the area with meticulous care. He stepped carefully around the body, noting a slight scuff on the floor, as if someone had dragged their foot in haste. A single mask lay not far off, an elegantly embroidered piece in burgundy and gold. Had it been John's, or had it belonged to someone else discarded in a panic? He stooped, lifting the mask with utmost caution, mindful not to disturb any potential clues. The interior was lined with velvet, the faint scent of perfume clinging to it. Carefully, Poirot placed it aside, deciding he would show it to Lady Althea or the other guests to see if any recognized it. His fingers then grazed the footman's lapel. When he pressed gently, an object shifted inside the pocket. Extracting it, he discovered a folded note. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. He unfolded the parchment to find but a single word scrawled in a neat, angular hand. Midnight. He reread the word, lips pursed in thought. The stroke of midnight had signaled the start of the masquerade's highlight. Surely that was no coincidence. Yet who had slipped this note into the footman's pocket? And why? Poirot's mind teemed with questions as he refolded the note and slid it gently into his waistcoat. A distant sound of footsteps broke his reverie. Another figure approached, Lady Althea Farnsworth, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture characteristically poised. She held her mask in one trembling hand. Monsieur Poirot, she spoke with quiet urgency. Lord Farnsworth is gathering everyone in the drawing room as you requested, but there is such unrest among them. Rumors, insinuations. I fear panic will soon take hold. Poirot inclined his head graciously. Lady Althea, I will do my utmost to keep the peace and to find out precisely how this tragedy has befallen us. He placed a comforting hand on her arm. If you could instruct the servants to keep the household calm, it would be a great help. Fear is an unwelcome companion for the truth, no? Her voice shook. Yes, I will see to it. And, Monsieur Poirot, you do believe this to be murder? A tremor caught in her throat as she spoke that last word. Poirot did not immediately answer. He glanced once more at the silent figure on the floor, the white gloves now stained by the dreadful finality of death. I believe, he said at length, that something far more sinister than an accident has occurred this night. But let us not speak of it too freely until we know more. She nodded, grief etched across her features. With a quiet instruction to a nearby maid, Lady Althea left to join the rest of the guests. Poirot took a final, lingering look at the scene, the stillness of the corridor, the flickering candlelight, the tangible aura of dread that hung in the air. The fateful note in his pocket seemed to pulse with significance. Yes, he thought to himself, there is a game afoot. Someone in Farnsworth Manor had counted upon the commotion of masquerading masks and midnight revelry to cloak a deadly deed. But who among these finely dressed guests, these loyal servants, these so-called friends, would dare to commit such an act? With measured steps, Poirot followed Lady Althea toward the drawing room, determined to learn what secrets might slumber behind the elaborate facades. The hush in the corridors felt too quiet, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting to see what discovery would come next. The detective, however, allowed no such hesitation to cloud his mind. He would proceed carefully, unraveling the many layers of the night's events, each mask, each word, each movement. For he knew beyond all doubt that the masquerade of Farnsworth Manor had only just begun, and with it a test of wits that might cost more than one life if the truth did not emerge swiftly. Chapter 3. Whispered Confessions by Morning's Pale Light. By the time the first pale rays of the winter sun touched the frosted windows of Farnsworth Manor, the house stood in a hush of mourning and subdued apprehension. Gone were the revelers' laughter and the rustle of silken gowns. In their place reigned a quiet tension that lay over every corridor like a fine layer of dust. Hercule Poirot, true to his meticulous nature, rose early, despite the late hours of the preceding night, and made his way down to the morning room, where a modest breakfast had been laid out on a polished walnut sideboard. He found Lady Althea Farnsworth already there, her gown a somber hue of mauve, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She started at his entrance, pressing a hand to her chest. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in a tremulous voice, "I beg your pardon, my nerves are quite frayed. We have never had such a tragedy befall us here." Poirot inclined his head gently. "But of course, madame, who could remain unmoved after such a night? I trust you managed a few hours of rest." "Very little," she confessed, her voice unsteady. "The household was in an uproar. No one seemed able to find repose. And of course, the authorities—" Her words trailed off as the sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Inspector Barnaby. Tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of quiet efficiency, he inclined his head to Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I am grateful for any assistance you can give. We must sort truth from panic before it claims another victim." His voice was grave, underscoring the delicate nature of the situation. Poirot acknowledged him with a courteous bow. "Inspector Barnaby, I am at your service." Then, with a gentle gesture toward Lady Althea, he suggested, "Perhaps we might begin by speaking with the members of the household separately, no? So many tongues wag at once. One can hardly keep them straight." Within the hour, the morning room had been cleared of all but Poirot, Inspector Barnaby, and one visitor at a time. The first to present himself was Lord Farnsworth's cousin, Mr. Rupert Farnsworth, a man of middle years whose refined attire belied the faint tremor in his hands. He bore no obvious family resemblance to his older cousin, apart from a certain hawkish set to his nose. Settling himself in a chair, he folded and refolded his handkerchief. "I cannot conceive," he said in a strained tone, "that anyone in this house would do such a thing. We are all friends, or at worst, distant acquaintances. John the footman was perfectly inoffensive." "Why harm him?" Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Oui, why indeed? Did you happen to see or hear anything out of the ordinary last night?" Rupert swallowed. "Nothing beyond the general chaos of that masked game. Truth be told, I was in the midst of conversation with Miss Penelope, Lady Althea's friend, when the scream echoed through the corridors. We ran at once to see what had happened, only to find poor John." Inspector Barnaby eyed him keenly. "And before that moment you noticed no disagreements?" Rupert only shook his head, and when excused he departed with a heavy sigh, shoulders sagging as he passed through the door. Next was the young heiress, Miss Clarissa Farnsworth, a willowy girl in her late teens who entered with her hands clasped anxiously. She seemed torn between curiosity and fright. "I hardly slept," she murmured, managing a wavering curtsy. Is it true there might be foul play? Poirot studied her face. The facts, mademoiselle, suggest something sinister. Did you see anything unusual last night? Perhaps an argument or a figure lurking in a corner? The girl's eyes flickered. I thought I glimpsed someone in a dark cloak near the back staircase, but we were all wearing masks. They were hurrying away, and I wasn't certain if it was a guest playing the game or... She shivered. I left immediately. Poirot thanked her and exchanged a glance with Inspector Barnaby, who scribbled a note in his leather-bound notebook. The butler, Mr. Hughes, came in next, a dignified man with impeccable posture and a carefully measured speech.
Welcome to Cafe
Sir, Miss Farnsworth, he said, nodding in deference. I can only say that the household staff was as taken by surprise as any of the guests. We had no warning, no inkling that anything amiss was afoot. Poirot scrutinized him. Can you recall John's demeanor before the tragedy? Did he seem distressed, or perhaps carrying out a task that put him in harm's way? Hughes shook his head with a calm certainty. He was instructed to collect empty glasses from the library after the masks were distributed. If he left that duty, it was not at my direction. One by one, Poirot and Inspector Barnaby spoke with an array of guests and servants. A scholarly fellow, Mr. Gardner, who claimed to be searching for a rare volume in the library, Miss Penelope, who could barely speak for weeping, and a footman named Thomas, whose face still bore the shock of discovering his fellow servant's body. Each told a slightly different version of the night's events, peppered with half-seen figures and contradictory recollections. Little by little, Poirot gathered a puzzle's worth of odd details, each piece seemingly unconnected, but hinting at darker revelations yet to come. By mid-morning, the sun had fully risen, and an icy winter light flooded the corridors of Farnsworth Manor. Poirot strode through the main hall, deep in thought. The hush that had settled over the estate was all the more eerie for the bright sunlight glinting on marble floors and polished banisters. Despite the calm, he sensed that tension seethed below the surface, like rapids beneath thin ice. Inspector Barnaby approached, eyes tired but resolute. Well, Poirot, do you glean any sense of our suspect? Poirot paused at the foot of the grand staircase, gazing up at the portraits of long-deceased Farnsworth ancestors. A sense, yes, but I am reminded that illusions can be maintained just as effectively by daylight as by candlelight. He turned with a thoughtful smile. Have patience, Inspector. The truth is whispering at these walls, and I mean to hear every syllable. Chapter 4. A second blow strikes. That very afternoon, the hush over Farnsworth Manor was broken once more, but this time with a scream that seemed to cut through every quiet corner of the estate. It was a raw, desperate sound, unlike the earlier cry that had brought the company upon poor John's lifeless form. Within moments, concerned guests and servants were hurrying toward the music room, where the shrieks still reverberated off walls adorned with portraits and the gentle hush of velveteen drapes. Hercule Poirot, who had been conferring with Lord Farnsworth in the library, wasted no time in joining the gathering throng. The moment he stepped into the music room, he felt the atmosphere shift from uneasy confusion to utter horror. At the far end of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the sloping grounds, an ornate gilded harp lay overturned. Beneath its curved pillar rested the fragile form of Miss Penelope, one of Lady Althea's guests. The room fell silent except for the ragged breathing of the onlookers who stood transfixed by the terrible sight. Poirot moved swiftly, gently ushering aside those who blocked his path. Inspector Barnaby, who had arrived only seconds earlier, knelt to examine Miss Penelope's limp hand. His grave expression told Poirot all he needed to know before he even reached the scene. Miss Penelope was beyond help. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered. his gaze alighting on the contusion that circled her slender neck, a bruise that revealed all too clearly that this was no accident. He turned to Lady Althea, who stood trembling at the threshold, her eyes wide with shock. "Madame," he said softly, "I must ask you and the other guests to wait in the adjoining sitting room. Inspector Barnaby and I must see to poor Miss Penelope." Lady Althea's lips parted as though she meant to speak, but no words came. With a trembling nod, she retreated, followed by the distressed assembly. Their murmurs merged into a low drone of fear and speculation, broken by an occasional sob from one of the more sensitive souls. Alone with Inspector Barnaby, Poirot took in every detail of the music room. A scattering of sheet music near the piano. A vase toppled from its stand, water seeping into the rich carpet. A cushion cast aside on one of the velvet chairs. He bent closer to Miss Penelope's neck, noting the distinct pattern of the bruise. "A large hand, perhaps?" he murmured. "Or something akin to a cord. One cannot be certain until the good doctor arrives." Inspector Barnaby grunted in agreement. "We shall know more once we can examine her properly. This is the second death in as many days, Poirot. I fear we have a desperate killer in our midst." Poirot gave a grave nod. "It would appear so. And with each new blow, the culprit grows bolder, or more careless. We must work quickly, mon ami, or there may be yet another tragedy." When they emerged from the music room, shutting the door behind them to keep prying eyes away, Poirot found Lady Althea and Lord Farnsworth awaiting them. The latter's face was ashen beneath his neatly trimmed moustache. How could this happen again, Monsieur Poirot?" he demanded in hushed tones. "In my home." Poirot laid a reassuring hand on the man's arm. "I promise you I will not rest until I discover who has done this, but I will need everyone's cooperation." Then, spotting the circle of distraught guests, he spoke in a carrying voice. "If you please, mes amis, remain calm. My colleague, Inspector Barnaby, must speak to each of you again. You will each recall your movements this afternoon, yes? Every word, every step." A flurry of worried glances passed between the guests. Some wore guilt in their expressions, others terror or disbelief. Miss Clarissa Farnsworth, the young heiress, clutched a lace handkerchief, tears sliding down her cheeks. She was perfectly well not an hour ago," she managed to say. "She played a small piece on the piano for me." Mr. Gardiner, the scholarly gentleman who had already come under minor suspicion the previous day, removed his spectacles and polished them with shaking fingers. "I heard her playing a waltz. It was quite beautiful. I assumed she was alone." From the doorway, the butler, Mr. Hughes, entered discreetly. "Sir," he addressed Lord Farnsworth, "Dr. Morley has arrived and awaits your instruction." Poirot glanced at Inspector Barnaby, who nodded. The doctor would no doubt confirm what they already suspected. Miss Penelope had been murdered. The question lingering over them was the same as before. Why? As the day wore on, the hush of shock settled deeper upon Farnsworth Manor. Rooms that had so recently rung with music and bright chatter now felt heavy with gloom. Guests huddled in small groups, whispering theories, each suspecting the other. At one point, Poirot observed an exchange between Rupert Farnsworth and Miss Clarissa, their eyes shifting nervously as they spoke in urgent tones. Elsewhere, he caught sight of Thomas the footman, face-stricken, pausing mid-step whenever the name Miss Penelope was uttered. Yet, for all their quiet hysteria, Poirot kept his composure. By late afternoon, as the pale light began to fade, he joined Inspector Barnaby in the library, where they spread out the meager clues they had collected thus far. A faint imprint of a muddy footprint had been discovered near the side entrance to the music room. A A servant reported hearing something heavy strike the floor, but could not say precisely when. Another insisted they had glimpsed someone slipping away in the corridor with remarkable haste. Poirot leaned back in a leather armchair, tapping his fingertips together in a rhythmic manner that hinted at deep concentration. Our murderer is close, Inspector. With John, perhaps there was secrecy, but with Miss Penelope, the deed seems more desperate, yet also deliberate. These are not random attacks. Inspector Barnaby folded his arms, a furrow in his brow. I only hope we can stop them from striking again. Poirot's gaze darkened. As do I, mon ami, for the sake of those under this roof, and for the sake of justice itself. Chapter 5. Shadows of Deceit. Late that afternoon, the weight of sorrow still pressed upon Farnsworth Manor. A chill wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows in their ancient casements, but inside the house all felt unnaturally still, like a stage awaiting its next act. Hercule Poirot stood in the gilded library, its tall windows half shrouded by heavy brocade drapes. The scent of old leather bindings mixed with the faintest trace of dust lent the room a solemn air. Yet it was here, amid the countless shelves of carefully arranged books, that Poirot had summoned several shaken guests to speak with him in private. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the richly paneled walls. In this soft, flickering light, Inspector Barnaby examined a small notebook, a faint frown marking his usually composed features. The detective's presence was steady and reassuring, and those who filed in, pale-faced and tense, clung to the hope that at last they might make sense of the tragedies befalling them. First to arrive was Mr. Gardiner, the scholarly gentleman, his pince-nez perched precariously upon the bridge of his nose as he approached Poirot with a tremulous smile. "Forgive me if I appear anxious," he said, voice quavering. "The events of these past days have distressed us all." Poirot inclined his head. "Bien sûr, Monsieur Gardiner. Pray, be seated. Inspector Barnaby and I wish only to clarify certain points." He gestured to a plush armchair near the hearth. "You mentioned once, did you not, that you were seeking a particular book in this very library on the night of John's death? Would you describe this book for us, if you please?" Mr. Gardiner dabbed his brow with a handkerchief. "A treatise on horticulture, penned by one of Lord Farnsworth's ancestors. Fascinating, or so I believed." He paused, fiddling nervously with his spectacles. "But with the masquerade in full swing, I found it impossible to concentrate. I left soon after." Inspector Barnaby's tone was cordial, but firm. "Did you notice anyone lingering here? Someone behaving oddly, perhaps in a rush?" The man hesitated. "I cannot say for certain. I was distracted by the music and voices echoing through the corridors, but—" He pursed his lips. "I do recall glimpsing a figure passing swiftly outside the library door, dressed in dark clothing, quite possibly a cloak." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A cloak, monsieur? Many guests wore elaborate costumes, oui? Yet it may be important." Mr. Gardiner nodded, swallowing hard. "I thought nothing of it at the time. I assumed it was a guest who wished to remain unseen, which, given the nature of the masquerade, did not strike me as altogether strange." Once Mr. Gardiner had been gently dismissed, Miss Clarissa Farnsworth, the young heiress, was shown in. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue. She clasped her hands together, trying to steady them. "Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, curtsying awkwardly, "I only wish I could be of more help." "And you shall, my dear," Poirot said kindly. He waited for her to settle upon a sofa covered in embroidered cushions. "The night Miss Penelope was found, did you see or hear anything before she was discovered beneath the harp?" Clarissa trembled at the memory. only the faint sound of the harp strings as though someone had knocked against them. Then I heard her scream, so dreadful. I rushed in, but by then it was... She closed her eyes. Inspector Barnaby nodded gravely. You recall no footsteps in the corridor? No voices raised in argument? She shook her head. Only the storm of panic that followed. Mr. Gardner and Lord Farnsworth's cousin Rupert arrived soon after. I remember Mr. Gardner exclaiming something about the overturned vase. Then Lady Althea was there, and we realized Miss Penelope was gone. Poirot offered a sympathetic smile. Merci, Mademoiselle Clarissa. If you think of any detail, however small, do let us know. When Clarissa departed, Inspector Barnaby's gaze followed her out. Poor girl, he murmured. She seems terrified. Poirot nodded.
Welcome to Cafe
2 deaths in so short a span would shake even the steadiest of souls. It does not help that Farnsworth Manor is so remote, with no respite from suspicion. Their next interviewee was Thomas, the footman who had found John's body. He entered with a hesitant bow and stood, hat in hand, eyes darting nervously about. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector, he began, voice tense. I've tried to recall anything else of use, but I fear I'm no better than I was before. The house was in an uproar last night, people running about, so many tears. Poirot studied him carefully. Tell me, Thomas, have you observed any unusual behavior amongst the guests? Any heated arguments or secret meetings? Thomas hesitated. There was some whispering in the servants' wing. Rumor about Miss Penelope having, a disagreement with Lord Farnsworth's cousin, but I never put much stock in gossip. Now, with her passing... He trailed off, swallowing hard. Poirot nodded. Rumors often contain a kernel of truth. Thank you, Thomas. That will be all for the moment. Left alone with Inspector Barnaby, Poirot took a thoughtful turn around the library, running his fingertips over the spines of neatly arrayed volumes. We have myriad threads, Inspector, he said quietly. A cloak glimpsed here, a whispered argument there, a lingering presence in the corridors. Yet how do these threads weave into a single tapestry? Inspector Barnaby exhaled a weary breath. We must identify who among the household stands to gain from these misdeeds. If there's a pattern, it lies somewhere in these secrets each person guards. Poirot's gaze flickered to a row of leather-bound ledgers. The secret motives, they rarely remain hidden for long. One must merely look closely and, as I often say, use the little grey cells. We shall discover what drives our murderer, and then... His voice dropped to a murmur. We will draw back the mask. A hush settled over the gilded library, broken only by the crackle of the fire. In that silence, Poirot and Inspector Barnaby silently vowed to unearth the truth before more tragedy could strike. Chapter 6. Moonlit footsteps and shrouded motives. Nightfall came swiftly to Farnsworth Manor, bringing with it an air of disquiet that seemed to settle in every corridor and chamber. A pale moon hung low in the sky, its silvery light casting elongated shadows through the mullioned windows.
Welcome to Cafe
In the hush that
Stories,
followed supper,
where
a
mysteries
meal
come to
taken in
light.
uneasy silence, nerves were frayed, and every footstep reverberated like an ominous drumbeat. Hercule Poirot, ever vigilant, moved along the dimly lit passageways with measured calm, his keen gaze passing over each flickering sconce and draped tapestry as though they might conceal some clue. He had just turned into the east wing when he nearly collided with young Miss Clarissa Farnsworth. Her face was flushed and her eyes brimmed with a secret alarm. Monsieur Poirot, she breathed, pressing a trembling hand to her bosom. I did not mean to startle you. Poirot bowed graciously. Mademoiselle Clarissa, you appear shaken. What is troubling you at this hour? She hesitated, glancing around to be sure they were alone. I heard something in my aunt's boudoir not long ago. Hushed voices, speaking of dreadful things. A debt to be paid, the removal of obstacles. I could not discern the speakers, only that one was female, the other male. It frightened me. Poirot studied her expression. Indeed, that is most peculiar, and perhaps most important. Did you hear anything more distinct? Perhaps a mention of names? No, she whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows. I feared being caught eavesdropping, so I slipped away. But Oh, Monsieur Poirot, with all that has happened, the murders, I am terrified. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Courage, mademoiselle. You have done well to tell me. This conversation may prove significant. Now go to your chamber, lock your door. Let me be the one to piece together this puzzle. When Clarissa departed, Poirot lingered, turning over her words in his mind. Debt, removing obstacles. Could these phrases connect the two tragic deaths, or hint at a potential third? He felt certain that beneath Farnsworth Manor's refined veneer lay an intricate web of motives. The moonlit corridors whispered of secrets and resentments. Poirot paused near a tall window, peering into the courtyard below. There, in the wavering gloom, he glimpsed a figure wrapped in a black cloak, hurrying across the gravel paths. Just as swiftly as it appeared, the shadow melted into the obscurity of a yew hedge. Poirot's pulse quickened. He considered giving chase, but decided against it. The figure could easily vanish amid the outbuildings, and there was more to be gained by careful observation than by a hasty pursuit in the dark.
Welcome.
Instead, he made his way to the small reading alcove adjacent to the drawing room, where Inspector Barnaby had set up a temporary command post of sorts. A modest table strewn with notes, statements, and other records they had gathered since the footman's death. Barnaby looked up as Poirot entered, his features etched with fatigue. You've seen something. Poirot inclined his head. A cloaked figure in the courtyard, though it vanished. And Mademoiselle Clarissa has overheard a most disconcerting conversation. Barnaby scribbled a note. Another mystery in an already tangled affair. I don't like it, Poirot, not one bit. The house is growing restless, the guests are in an uproar, and Lady Althea is beside herself. Poirot set down a small lamp he had carried. All the more reason for us to remain level-headed, my friend. I suspect tonight will bring further revelations. He paused, then added softly, I only hope no further harm comes to any within these walls. The hush of the manor thickened as the hours crept toward midnight. At some point, Poirot took to the corridors once more, guided by an almost preternatural intuition that something was astir. But aside from an occasional flash of a candle from under a guest room door, the halls were empty. Eventually, he allowed himself a brief rest. Morning dawned grey and sullen, blanketing the surrounding countryside in a soft haze. After dressing quickly, Poirot proceeded downstairs. He noticed at once a flurry of subdued commotion near the billiard room. The door stood ajar, and a knot of guests, Rupert Farnsworth among them, milled about, wearing expressions of startled confusion. Poirot! Rupert called, beckoning him inside. You must see this. Poirot stepped through, closely followed by Inspector Barnaby. The scene that greeted them made his brows rise in surprise. Propped upon the green baize of the billiard table lay a mask. It was embellished with bright feathers, sinister in its elongated beak-like design. No body lay nearby, no outward sign of violence marred the plush carpet. Yet something about this solitary mask struck a disturbing chord. Whose mask is that? Barnaby demanded of the assembled onlookers. A trembling voice came from one of the guests, Mr. Gardner, the scholarly gentleman. I cannot be certain, Inspector. So many were distributed that night, and each passed through multiple hands. His spectacles glinted in the weak daylight.
To Cafe Stories,
Rupert Farnsworth
where
ran a
mysteries
hand
come
through
to
his
life.
hair. It looks different, he mused. Surely it was not among those we wore for the masquerade. Did someone bring it here after Miss Penelope's death as a warning? Poirot approached the table, carefully lifting the mask by its edges. He turned it over, noting a curious scrawl inside, faint but unmistakable. A monition indeed, he said quietly. There is a single letter drawn here, L. Whether it belongs to the mask's maker or stands for something else, I do not yet know. Inspector Barnaby shot Poirot a grave look. It's a message, of that I am certain. Another piece in this twisted game, but by whom? Poirot returned the mask to the table. That, Inspector, is the question on all our minds. Our killer is brazen enough to leave a token, perhaps to taunt us, or to confuse us. Nevertheless, we must persist in our pursuit. Each clue brings us closer to unveiling the truth. With that, he surveyed the tense faces gathered around. Panic and suspicion swirled in their eyes, each uncertain where the next blow might fall. Poirot, for his part, only felt his resolve deepen. The darkness cloaking Farnsworth Manor must be dispelled, or it would consume them all. Chapter 7. A Tangle of Accusations. The grand salon at Farnsworth Manor was a spectacle of fading splendor. Gilded mirrors reflected the weak winter light, heavy velvet drapes muted the waning afternoon sun, and an ornate chandelier loomed above like a silent sentinel. Yet in that majestic room, the atmosphere was fraught with tension. Guests and members of the household gathered at Hercule Poirot's behest, clustering uneasily upon brocade settees or standing behind chairs as though seeking some semblance of security. The strain on every countenance revealed that suspicions were running dangerously high. Poirot, his posture immaculate as ever, stood at the front of the salon, near the unlit fireplace. His keen eyes swept across the assembled company. "Mes amis," he began, his gentle accent lending an oddly soothing note to the tension. "We have endured tragedy upon tragedy within these walls, and yet it is my conviction that the truth remains persistent, n'est-ce pas, if we would but open our eyes to it." The silence that followed was broken by a rustling of skirts and the creak of an antique chair. Finally, Inspector Barnaby, stationed off to one side, cleared his throat.
Welcome to Cafe Stories,
"We ask for your
where
cooperation,"
mysteries come
he
to
said,
life.
his voice weighted with urgency. "No more half answers, no more evasion. We need facts, lest another life be lost." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Lady Althea Farnsworth, pale but composed, inclined her head ever so slightly. "Yes," she said in a low voice. "We must not allow this fiend to strike again under my roof." Poirot's gaze traveled over Rupert Farnsworth, whose face was drawn with worry, over Miss Clarissa, fidgeting with a lace handkerchief, over Mr. Gardner, tapping a foot in restless anxiety. The butler, Mr. Hughes, stood at the edge of the room, hands clasped before him in a posture of rigid decorum. Each figure seemed enveloped in their own private turmoil. "Let us examine," Poirot continued, "the most recent events. The appearance of the mysterious mask upon the billiard table, bearing the letter L. I ask you, who among us might that initial signify? Or is it but a symbol meant to distract?" His moustache twitched with quiet fervor. "Nothing is ever as it seems." A cacophony of anxious voices erupted. "Surely it is not a reference to Lord Farnsworth?" exclaimed Mr. Gardner, looking at the master of the house. "I swear to you," Lord Farnsworth said, stepping forward, "I know nothing of this. My name is Edmund Farnsworth. I bear no such initial." Rupert Farnsworth, overshadowed by his cousin's taller figure, ventured an uneasy laugh. It could stand for Lucifer for all we know, a sinister jest by the culprit designed to confound us. At that, Miss Clarissa let out a strangled sob. Must we speak of devils and demons? We are dealing with a murderer, not a phantom. Poirot raised a hand to restore quiet. Mademoiselle Clarissa, calm yourself. The human mind can conjure devils, yes, but always there is a motive behind such conjurations. This killer has a reason, either cunning or desperate, perhaps both. But rest assured, the motive is mortal. Inspector Barnaby took a step forward. Motive, he repeated, letting the word hang in the hush. Money, jealousy, revenge. We must not forget the whispered conversation about debts and obstacles. His glance swept around, seeking any flicker of guilt. Lady Althea's voice trembled as she spoke. So many of us in the Farnsworth circle have known each other for years. Surely we would sense if one among us bore malice enough to kill? Poirot regarded her sadly. Such illusions, madame, are often the most dangerous. We believe we know our friends, our family, but secrets can fester beneath the veneer of polite society. A stirring at the doorway drew attention. Thomas, the footman, looked in uncertainly. Beg pardon, milady, Inspector, but I overheard talk that you would be gathering here. May I be of any service? His eyes darted about, not quite meeting anyone's gaze. Inspector Barnaby nodded. Yes, lad. We are simply reviewing what we know. Wait outside, if you please, until we call for you. Thomas withdrew, casting a troubled glance at Poirot. The detective returned it with a slight nod, taking note of the young man's anxious posture. Then, turning back to the assembled group, he addressed them again, his voice low yet firm. We cannot solve this crime by relying upon a single vantage. Each of you has observed something, some fleeting moment or overheard whisper, that seemed unimportant at the time. I urge you, share every detail with Inspector Barnaby or with me. Hold back nothing. Another life hangs in the balance. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Lord Farnsworth rested a hand on Lady Althea's shoulder while Miss Clarissa twisted her handkerchief so tightly that the lace threatened to tear. Mr. Gardiner shifted his weight from foot to foot, glasses slipping down his nose. Rupert stood rigid, hands thrust into his pockets as though staving off a chill. Poirot surveyed them all, his expression solemn. Despite his calm bearing, the urgency in his manner was unmistakable. He recognized too well that the killer, if present, would be watching his every move, weighing how best to evade detection or strike again. My friends, Poirot said, his voice resonating in the hush, fear not that we shall fail. The noose about the culprit's neck is tightening. Even if we have not yet found the final piece of this puzzle, we are closer than before. The masquerade cannot last forever. Silence followed his pronouncement, broken only by the distant ticking of a grand mantel clock. In that silence lay both dread and hope. Dread that any one of them might soon meet a terrible fate, and hope that the relentless pursuit of truth would out. And thus, the denizens of Farnsworth Manor waited, each certain that another step had been taken toward revelation, yet all too aware that the final unmasking still lay shrouded in shadows. Chapter 8. The Truth and the Treachery. Daybreak arrived on Farnsworth Manor with a thin veil of mist creeping along the lawns, as though nature itself was reluctant to reveal what lurked in the lingering darkness. Word had spread that Hercule Poirot requested everyone gather in the drawing room at precisely 9 o'clock, and tension buzzed like an electric current through every corridor. Servants moved in hushed urgency, placing extra chairs, stoking the fire, and ensuring that at the detective's command there would be no distractions and no excuses for tardiness. When the great clock in the hall chimed the appointed hour, the large double doors to the drawing room swung open. There, Standing by the mantel was Poirot, his stance regal, his gaze assessing each individual as they found their seat in an uneasy semicircle around him. Inspector Barnaby stood near the window, arms folded, prepared to document the final revelations. "Monsieur Poirot," Lady Althea Farnsworth said quietly, her voice carrying a note of forced composure. She took her place on a silk-upholstered chair, back ramrod straight. "We have come, as you requested." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, madame. You have shown great courtesy in allowing me the freedom to pursue this inquiry. I can promise you, our patience is about to be rewarded." A subdued hush fell across the assembly. Lord Farnsworth, looking older than his years, sat with his fingers tapping anxiously on the arm of his chair. Miss Clarissa Farnsworth gripped a lace handkerchief, occasionally dabbing her eyes as though anticipating fresh tears. Rupert Farnsworth paced behind a chair, restless energy radiating from him. Mr. Gardner busied himself adjusting his spectacles. The butler, Mr. Hughes, stood near the door, dignified and alert. Thomas, the footman, hovered at a distance, hands clenched nervously. None in the room appeared truly calm, for each face bore the mark of sleepless nights and gnawing dread. Poirot studied them all for a moment, then clasped his hands behind his back. "Mes amis, in the last few days we have seen a masquerade end in bloodshed, and tragedies unfold that none of us could have anticipated. Poor John, the unfortunate footman, was the first victim. Then Miss Penelope, discovered lifeless beneath the fallen harp. A series of ominous clues, whispers in the corridors, a masked warning on the billiard table. These events seemed disjointed. Yet in truth, they form a single tapestry, woven by the mind of our killer." A collective intake of breath betrayed the heightened anticipation. Even Inspector Barnaby, though he had worked in tandem with Poirot, seemed on edge, waiting to hear how the final puzzle piece would fit. Poirot began his narrative in a measured tone. "Firstly, we must ask, why kill the footman, John? He was, by all accounts, a pleasant young man. What secret could possibly justify his death?" He paused, scanning the faces before him. John had discovered something. He possessed knowledge that threatened our culprit's scheme. Indeed, I found a note in his pocket, marked only with the word midnight. The significance I now realize was that John was supposed to meet someone at that hour, likely to exchange information or deliver a warning. He never had the chance. Eyes darted around the circle, as though trying to discern who might have silenced John. Rupert Farnsworth cleared his throat, but Poirot continued unheeding. "Next," he went on, "we have Miss Penelope, a second victim found beneath an overturned harp. The mark upon her neck indicated strangulation, clearly a deliberate act. But why Miss Penelope? She was the life of the party, charming and musical. Was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was she also privy to a dangerous secret?" Inspector Barnaby allowed himself a brief nod of encouragement. Poirot's voice rose just enough to draw every eye. "Finally, we discovered that cryptic mask upon the billiard table. An ostentatious piece with a single letter, L, scrawled inside. A signature, or an illusion, meant to puzzle us, and, mes amis, puzzle us it did, until I recalled Miss Clarissa's words. She overheard a conversation about a debt to be paid and obstacles to be removed. That told me we were dealing with someone operating under extreme financial pressure, willing to do anything to secure their fortune or their reputation." A stunned silence blanketed the drawing room. No one dared speak, though Lady Althea's cheeks flushed with anxiety. Rupert Farnsworth folded his arms across his chest, frowning. Mr. Gardner removed his spectacles, looking dazed. In that moment, Poirot shifted his posture, gaze zeroing in on one individual. And so, he continued, I turned my thoughts to each of you, analyzing who might be desperate enough. Who among you lives beneath the weight of crushing debts, or stands to lose all if certain truths come to light? A faint rustle of fabric broke the stillness. Poirot's eyes locked on the butler, Mr. Hughes, then swept to Rupert Farnsworth and then pointedly back to Lady Althea. Each flinched beneath his scrutiny, but he did not linger on them. Finally, Poirot's gaze came to rest on the one person who had, until then, kept to the background. Thomas, the footman. Thomas's Adam's apple bobbed. His knuckles whitened around the brim of the hat he held. Me, Monsieur Poirot? He stammered, voice cracking. Yes, Thomas, Poirot said, softly yet unyieldingly. The black cloak glimpsed in the courtyard, the sudden appearances at key moments, the tremors in your voice whenever the debts were mentioned. I surmised you might have lived beyond your means. Perhaps gambling debts, perhaps other obligations you could not repay. But there is more, is there not? The footman's cheeks blanched. He looked about as though seeking an escape, but Inspector Barnaby had shifted subtly, blocking the route to the door. I do owe money, Thomas managed, voice quivering, but I swear I would never... Poirot raised a finger. You see, it was not just gambling debts. When I spoke with you initially, I found your anxiety excessive, even for someone who had just discovered a body. And there was the matter of your knowledge of the house's comings and goings. You knew precisely where each guest would be, and you had reason to overhear Miss Penelope speaking with John about something suspicious. John had stumbled upon your ledger of debts, had he not? Thomas's eyes widened in terror. He threatened to expose me, he said, voice trembling, with the weight of an unburdened secret. He was going to tell Lady Althea that valuables had gone missing, that I was forging small withdrawals from the household accounts. I feared... You feared the consequences, Poirot supplied. And so you lured him away under the guise of a rendezvous, likely in exchange for silence, and murdered him. When Miss Penelope grew suspicious, perhaps having overheard you, or seen you near John's body, she too had to be silenced. Her death was more desperate, more frantic. A gasp of disbelief rose from the gathering. Lady Althea stared at Thomas aghast. Miss Clarissa's eyes, filled with horror, darted to Poirot for confirmation. Rupert Farnsworth cursed under his breath. Poirot pressed on. As for the mask on the billiard table, that was pure bravado designed to mislead us, an attempt to suggest some sinister outside presence or an elaborate vendetta. But you overreached, mon ami. Too many small details accumulated. One can only keep up a masquerade for so long. Thomas's trembling grip on his hat tightened. I didn't mean for it to go so far. John threatened to ruin me and Miss Penelope. She was going to tell Lord Farnsworth what she'd seen. His words poured out in a torrent of panic and remorse. I thought if I planted false leads, you'd suspect someone else. The letter L... I hoped you'd think it was Lord Farnsworth or some unknown figure, but I never guessed the great Hercule Poirot would find the truth so quickly. At that, Thomas collapsed into a chair, shoulders quaking with sobs. The room reverberated with shock and dismay. Inspector Barnaby quietly stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Thomas, I must place you under arrest for the murders of John and Miss Penelope. Lady Althea sank onto a nearby settee, her composure shattered. All this evil, over some stolen household funds? Poirot offered a sympathetic expression. Unfortunately, madame, even small sins can grow into monstrous ones when desperation takes hold. This was no grand conspiracy, but it was murder, nonetheless. As Barnaby escorted the trembling Thomas out, the remaining guests remained in stunned silence. The hush grew palpable, like the mansion itself was finally exhaling. Poirot turned to Lady Althea and with a small bow spoke softly. "The game of faces is ended, Lady Farnsworth. I believe you may now rest easier, though I regret the sorrow that has come to pass." She could only nod, blinking back tears. In the softened light of morning, it seemed as though Farnsworth Manor stood on the cusp of renewed life. The oppressive weight of fear was lifting, even as the spectre of tragedy could never fully be erased. One by one, the guests and household members quietly dispersed, each lost in reflection over what had transpired under this venerable roof. Hercule Poirot remained behind in the drawing room for a few moments, gazing out the tall windows upon the misty estate grounds. His face was solemn, touched by the sadness of justice accomplished only at great cost. Then with measured grace he placed his hat upon his head, smoothed his immaculate moustache, and took his leave, knowing that the truth, at last, had been unmasked. Farnsworth Manor fell silent in the days after Thomas was led away in Inspector Barnaby's custody. Tragedy lingered in echoing corridors, yet evil behind it was banished. The servants moved with muted steps, dusting the marble floors that had recently witnessed heartbreak and betrayal. Lady Althea Farnsworth, though outwardly poised, was forever changed, her nights haunted by the knowledge that blood had been spilled under her roof. Miss Clarissa retreated into quiet reflection, cherishing her innocence yet burdened by the memory of sorrow's sudden intrusion upon youthful dreams. Rupert Farnsworth now bore the grave countenance of a man who had looked into the face of mortality and found it alarmingly close. For a single moment, beneath the endless grey sky, Farnsworth Manor breathed again. The weight of unsaid truths and stifled secrets lightened, leaving behind a sense of fragile hope. Hercule Poirot, silent and reflective, made his farewells, aware that in unveiling one mystery, he had peeled back the thin veneer of security that all families cling to. Hope, however tenuous, slowly unfurled in every heart. And as he departed, the ancient stone walls stood watch over the estate, awaiting the next secret they might be called upon to keep. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.